Good morning. I'm Phil Westbush, and I will try to walk you through how we use the landscape theory to compute devices like light-emitting diodes. So let me tell you one thing, this is kind of applied physics, okay? You should know that to make simulations of devices, you don't only need to know everything about devices. You need to know all the physics behind the devices. So I'm not a device person, I'm a physicist, fundamental physicist, but you should know that people doing simulations of devices know all the physics, plus the devices. And you will see that indeed to compute a real world device, you have to know quantum mechanics and localization and disorder and so on. So I will walk you through 4 papers that were published in the recent years and some more recent results. And of course I will be at the same time somewhat elementary because we have a number of mathematicians in the room and I would not like to lose them right away because I'm talking about semiconductors, okay, which is not really a mathematical object. So I will discuss basically, this is a real computation actually, of energy levels of electrons in a disordered semiconductor, which is indium gallium nitride. This is what we do, like light-emitting diodes, which is the new revolution in lighting and energy savings. So you see that you have 2 types of disorders. You have a disorder for electrons, and you have disorder for holes, and you have photons emitted, and I will try to walk you through all of these. And you see that we have quite a number of collaborators here from École Polytechnique in France. This is from University of California at Santa Barbara, and also from National Taiwan University, UNN, doing the simulations. So what is an LED? It's a piece of semiconductor, or a piece of wafer of semiconductor. You see that you have several layers. You have an active layer which emits photons. You see that you have electronic carriers, charge carriers, electrons and holes. You have a source of energy, and this electrical energy is transformed into photons. A light-emitting diode is an energy converter, transforming electricity into light. What is very interesting is that in principle, you can get up to 100% energy conversion from electricity to light. And actually, playing a little more games, you could get more than 100% efficiency, meaning you could get more energy from light than you are putting from your electrical source. There is, of course, a trick there. It's because you can get some energy from the lattice thermal energy. Okay, and you could convert heat into light, which is a little strange because you think that heat is a bad energy and light is a good energy, well-ordered energy. And actually, this is an old problem which was solved actually in 46, by the great physicist Landau, which showed that indeed you can transform thermal energy from a lattice into photons because the entropy of photons that are emitted is larger than the entropy of a thermal disorder of a lattice, which was not obvious at all, but it can be done. So you are not violating the second law of thermodynamics doing this. But anyway, we're not yet there. We try to get towards 100% before getting more than 100%, and we have to understand how these things work. Starting with perfect semiconductors, a perfect semiconductor is a perfect crystal of atoms. So you have a periodic arrangement of atoms to infinity, over millions of rows of atoms. And electrons will see then, when the electrons that are present in the system will see a periodic potential. They are subject to electric potential. And then this was a big surprise of quantum mechanics in the 20s, is why can electrons propagate at infinity without feeling disorder? You would think that the mean free path of an electron would be the distance between two atoms, and actually you can measure that electrons can travel all through millimeters, so billions of atoms without being deflected. And this is because the solution of the Schrödinger equation for the electron motion is a delocalized wave, it's a Bloch wave. The electrons feel somewhat the periodic potential, but at the same time they move freely like a plane wave, and their true wave function is just the product of a plane wave and a localized wave function, and this is called a Bloch wave. And a Bloch wave can go to infinity. There's no disorder there, of course. And then when you compute the energy levels of these electrons, what you find is that the electrons are organized in energy bands. And of course, what is specific to semiconductors compared to metals is that you have what is called a forbidden gap. You have states below the gap which are occupied by electrons. So you have electron states here. You could have electron states above the forbidden gap. Okay, this is what we call the conduction band. But those states are not occupied at 0 degree temperature. Normally, all the states in one band are occupied, and the states above that are not occupied, and this is a forbidden gap. And in principle, such a system is insulating. You have all the states, this is another representation here as a function of position. All the states in the valence band, the lower band, are occupied, so an electron cannot go from one state to another, and you have no electrons in the conduction band. Of course, this is a zero temperature picture. When you are at finite temperature, you can excite, you have some thermal excitation of electrons. You can get in the upper band, the conduction band. Of course, you have many other bands. I'm just describing the two most interesting ones for us. And you have lower valence bands, you have other higher conduction bands. And here, when you excite some electrons from the full valence band, you create holes in the valence band. Now, an electron could hop from one state to the other, from one position to the other. So you can have conduction of charges, electrical conduction, by these missing electrons, which we call holes. And then you can also have conduction in the conduction band, because an electron can find different spots in the valence band, in the conduction band, and they can move along. So then you have electrical conductivity. This would be what we call an intrinsic semiconductor. In nature, those don't exist, basically, because you always have electrical impurities, what we call dopants. You have impurities, and you have two main types of impurities. You have donor impurities, for which the energy levels are very near the conduction band, and then they can lose an electron thermally to the conduction band, and then you create electrons in the conduction band. Then you have electrical conductivity, one way, and the other way to have conductivity is to put acceptor ions, acceptor impurities, which will capture electrons from the valence band. They will leave a hole behind, and they will become negatively charged. So this was a big mystery of semiconductors during many years in the early years of the 20th century. But when you put impurities in a semiconductor, they conduct better electricity because you are creating more electrons or more holes in the material. And this is exactly contradictory to what you see in metals. When you put impurity in a metal, you conduct less because you will scatter your electrons. But of course, when you put more impurities in semiconductor, it will scatter more because you are farther away from a purely periodic lattice. But at the same time, you increase the number of carriers. And what takes over is that you have more carriers to conduct electricity, even though each carrier is submitted to more collisions, can travel less easily through the periodic lattice. So this was a big mystery because people were doing things to their materials, and they thought, oh, it conducts better, so it is purer, because we thought of a metal, and actually they were more conductive because we had more impurities. We are not pure, we were less pure. So you can imagine for tens of years, this was a mystery until everything was understood in the mid-30s. So anyway, we have a way, and this is what is specific to semiconductors. You can change their conductivity by putting in impurities. And this you cannot do with metals or insulators actually. So now we have to look, the next thing we just need to know is there's another way to put electrons and holes in a semiconductor is to shine light, and then you can excite an electron from the valence band to the conduction band. This is an absorption process. You absorb light. You transfer energy from the photon, from the light, to the semiconductor by exciting an electron in a higher energy level. The reverse process is recombination of an electron with a hole, which would be an existing state, empty state in the valence band, and you would emit a photon, so you would have light emission. So this is light emission and absorption across the band gap of the semiconductor. Wow, that's great. Because if I am able to put at the same position of the semiconductor electron and holes, I will emit light. So this will be a light emitting diode. So the problem is, how can we do this? And to do this, we just put next to each other pieces of semiconductor with either electrons and holes. So to have electrons, I put donor impurities on one side, and on the other side I will put acceptor impurities. So I know that I will have electrons on one side, holes on the other side. Actually, when the electrons and holes will recombine, they will leave the ions, donor ions or acceptor ions behind. And of course, those charged impurities will give me an electric field which will repulse electrons and holes and will create an energy barrier. So I don't want to go into details. So this is called the p-n junction, and then in equilibrium, electrons will remain on one side, holes will remain on one side. That's the way to know it. Equilibrium, nothing happens, of course. But now, if I apply an electric field, if I apply a voltage, then I will diminish the energy barrier between electron and holes, and so electrons can move up the hill here, electrons will move down, holes will move down, and I can have a region in between where I have electrons and holes in the same spatial position, and then they can recombine and emit light. So actually, to make light-emitting diodes, I just have to put a p-n junction, a piece of semiconductor with electrons, a piece of semiconductor with holes, and applying an electric field, I will have some recombination of electrons and holes in between. You have to make it a little better to have efficient light emissions. You would have some emission. Any p-n junction, piece of material with p and n region, will emit light. And this was observed at the beginning of the 20th century, very early. But if you want it to be efficient, of course, you have to play some tricks. And for instance, the main trick that we use is we make heterostructures. We don't use an homogeneous semiconductor material. We use we sandwich a piece of semiconductor with a smaller energy band gap between two regions with larger energy band gaps, so that electrons and holes will pile up in regions with energies, where energies are smaller, so they are more concentrated, and being more concentrated, electrons and holes will recombine more efficiently. So this is the heterostructure. We call that an heterostructure, semiconductor heterostructure. This was a big invention in the 60s. For that invention, Krömer and Alferod got the Nobel Prize because this is what gave rise to efficient semiconductor lasers, which are at the root of optical telecommunications, and you know how much optical telecommunications changed our civilization. So this was a big, big invention, the semiconductor heterostructure. But it's good for lasers, it's also very good for LEDs. And so, when we want to do light-emitting diodes, and what is interesting, the light-emitting diodes in which we're interested are in the visible range, we have to look at the world map of semiconductors, and we see that a few semiconductors have a band gap where we will emit light in the visible, and the best semiconductors that we have is the nitride family of semiconductors. So it's gallium nitride, aluminum nitride, or indium nitride, and the alloys. And by changing the composition of alloys, we can span the whole visible range. So it's a magnificent material system. I won't discuss how we got to efficient light emission from nitride. For that invention, Nakamura, Amano, and Nakazaki got the Nobel Prize in 2014, so this was a major breakthrough. But I want to discuss how can we model the properties. You see that if we take pure materials, okay, gallium nitride, indium nitride, or gallium nitride, we don't get visible emission. To get visible emission, we have to mix the materials, so actually we mix gallium nitride and indium nitride. This will give us an alloy of indium gallium nitride, where we have variable concentrations of indium in gallium nitride, and due to the fact that we have this alloy, we can span all the colors of the visible. And now we are getting into the problem. We have to be able to describe alloys, to describe how LEDs will work. And this is where landscape will come in. So the basic fact of nitride alloys is that if we do an atomic analysis, an atom probe tomography analysis of the composition of a material in an LED, so you have to think that the material of LED is made of stacks of layers. I told you that we are doing heterostructure, so the grayish part is gallium nitride, large band gap material, and we inject carriers, electron and holes, in the violet parts, which is the indium gallium nitride alloy. And when we look at the positions of indium atoms in those layers of indium gallium nitride, we find that those indium atoms are randomly positioned. We have a random alloy of atoms, of indium atoms, into a gallium nitride matrix. And then it tells us that if we have random distribution, of course, then we have fluctuations of composition, and these fluctuations of compositions give rise to local variations of composition of indium. So this is, for instance, a distribution of compositions for 17% average indium composition alloy, And you see that you have very large fluctuations between 11% and 21%. Just having a random system gives you large compositional fluctuations. And if I look now at the cross-section, okay, in plane of the indium gallium nitride quantum well layer, I see that these are the indium atom positions. This is experimental here. So if I want to connect this to the landscape theory that Marcel described, I have now to construct what is the random potential. I have this random position of atoms. I want to know what is the random potential to be able to compute Schrödinger equation, landscape equation, and so on. So the way we do that, so this is work by Yuran Hu in Taiwan. You generate a grid for mapping the atoms. You put the random distribution, you write the random distribution of your indium atoms. Due to the uncertainty in the position of atoms, actually you put a Gaussian distribution of position of atoms, and then you are transforming what was before discrete distribution of indium atom into a continuous variable due to the fact that you are using indeed this Gaussian distribution of contribution of each atom. Now you have a variable, continuous variable of composition, which comes from your random discrete distribution of indium atoms. When you do that, so doing that, there are some approximations here. So I will go for many approximations, okay? So this is the first approximation. But when we do that, it's nice. We can have in the layers that constitute a light emitting diode maps of composition. Okay. Now I'm doing a big approximation. I'm doing what is called the effective mass approximation. I want to transform this map of composition into a map of energy levels for electron and holes. To do that, and there are many ways to do, there are several ways to do that. The one we use is the effective mass approximation, and I believe this afternoon Professor Avreli will describe another way to do it from first principle. But what we use here is the simplest way to do it. We suppose that we know what is the band gap of an alloy for a given composition. It's an ill-defined quantity, because of course the energy of an alloy will depend from point to point by the composition. So I'm taking an average value over space average value of indium composition and indium band gap and indium dependent value of the conduction band energy and indium dependent, indium composition dependent position on the valence band of the band gap and each of the energy bands. And this is given by, okay, so the band gap varies with composition of indium composition X as it's the balance between the band gap of gallium nitride, the band gap of indium nitride, and it's not a linear relationship with composition, it is a quadratic relationship, and this we call this factor, the quadratic, in front of the quadratic factor, the Bowen parameter. And again, the Bowen parameter is an ill-defined quantity. But let's admit it does exist indeed. And then we say, well, I have the variation of the band gap, and I'm saying that 60%, 63% of the band gap, local band gap variation is due to the conduction band, and then the 37 is due to the valence band. So then I know exactly, I know somewhere the composition, and then I know that 64% is in the conduction band, 37 in the valence band. And so I have transformed my composition map into a map of energy level for the connection bands of a valence band. So now I have my potential in which my electrons and holes will travel. Big approximation. So then I have a few more parameters. So I know what is the connection band, valence band position. And now I can work through the landscape. So what I just showed you is that in the layers of an LED, I have a map of energy levels for electron and holes. And in principle, now, so an electron moves into a disordered potential. Of course, underlying is the periodic potential at a much smaller scale, but I forget that one. I have a variable disordered potential for electrons, and I have to know the true energy levels of the electrons in that potential. And of course, I have to, for that, I have to solve a Schrödinger equation for an electron in a disordered potential. So that's where the landscape theory comes in. You remember that Marcel Piloch told you from this disordered potential, which was a mathematical potential, you go from the Schrödinger equation to the landscape equation in the variable u, and one of the u is an effective potential. You work through that, and he explained to you that indeed when you have the effective potential, one over u, you can also have the density of states. And for instance, for one layer of indium gallium nitride, I can go from the energy, from the disordered potential for the electrons in the conduction band to 1 over u for electrons. And I can do the same for, I think this is just electrons. So I go no, this is the hole. So I can do that for the electrons and for the holes. And I have the maps of energy levels for electrons and holes, and for 1 over u. It's interesting to see what happens when we go from the map of the conduction band to the map of 1 over u, of the landscape function. And if you plot, if I take a cross-section for those two maps, what I find is that you see that the red curve is for the conduction band energy, and the blue curve, it should be blue, this one should be blue, is for the effective potential 1 over u. And you see that the amplitude of fluctuations of EC are much larger than the fluctuations for 1 over u. And what it means here is exactly the result that Marcel told you, that when you have a very steep, deep fluctuation of the conduction band, it means you will have energy confinement, carrier confinement. The carriers won't go so deep. Of course, this is a quantum way, like a localized quantum level, and then the energies goes up. So you are taking into account, by the landscape theory, you are taking into account quantum confinement. And the reverse is true. If you have a large fluctuation, a steep amount of energy, you can have tunneling of the electron state from one position to the other. And actually, you will smooth out also the peaks of energy due to quantum tunneling. So you see here that indeed you take into account both effects of quantum confinement and tunneling by the function 1 over u. And this is why most of the quantum effects what you would find in Schrödinger equation are taken into account by the landscape equation. This is well seen here. So now that we have all of that, we can try to check how the theory works. So we can model some experiments. So the first experiment that we try to model is the absorption coefficient, absorption measurements. So we are sending photons into this disordered potential of electron and holes. We have transitions from the valence band to the conduction band. And of course, the absorption energy will depend on the position, okay, depending whether we have a peak or a deep state here. We have energies which vary point by point. And when you look at the absorption edge, at the absorption layer of the band gap energy, so if you have photons below the band gap, of course you don't absorb. And when you increase the energy, you start to absorb. And when you reach the average energy of electrons and holes, you have a plateau. But below that, you have an exponential shape of the absorption curve. And this exponential shape here in this region is called the Hubbard tail of your absorption coefficient. The Hubbard tail of absorption coefficients is a huge topic in semiconductor systems. Of course, one of the reasons that you can have absorption below the band gap is due to thermal excitations, but here it's due to the disorder, to the alloy disorder, because we have those local fluctuations of energies. So we can measure this by doing a conductivity measurement, a photoconductivity measurement. And to compute this absorption curve, we just have to compute all the transitions that are possible from one state in the valence band to state in conduction band. And you have two contributions. One, of course, is the density of states. Okay, locally, how does, when we increase the energy, what is the density of states going up? And of course, the other contribution is the overlap of wave functions between the electron and hole. Of course, if the electron and hole don't overlap, there is no absorption. You need some overlap of wave function. And here again, it's a huge approximation. Instead of taking the true electron and hole wave functions, we just take the overlap of the partition of U functions in the conduction band and valence band, and we just take the overlap of wave functions, of true wave functions, is the overlap of electron and holes in the U subregions. Okay, so this is a big approximation, but it works very well. It will have to be later justified. But if we look as a function of composition, the Hubbard tail, the absorption edge of indium gallium nitride quantum wells, you see that indeed they fit quite well. You see that the experiment is the full curve, and the theory is the dashed curve, which is quite interesting because this is the first instance when you see that the absorption edge is determined by disorder and not by thermal fluctuations, which is not the case usually. But it's because the disorder in indium gallium nitride alloys is considered very strong. If you look into more details, sorry, I went too fast. If you look at the maps of fluctuations of EC and fluctuations of U, you see that indeed, again, the fluctuations in EC are much stronger than for U, because in U, you have smoothed out the fluctuations, by quantum confinement and by quantum tunneling. And if you look at the overall result, you find that as a function of helium composition, the fluctuations of EC and EV are quite big, are of the order of 30 to 50 millielectron volts. And when you look at the fluctuations of 1 over UH and 1 over UE, okay, the fluctuation of 1 over U for electron and volts, you see that they are quite smaller, just around 30 millivolts, again due to the smoothing by quantum confinement and quantum tunneling. And this is why indeed the surprising results that we got, it was a surprise for us, it was those band edge don't change that much with disorder. Okay, what you find is that indeed all of them are about the same, they don't change too much, okay, in the real world, those fluctuations. What would be very interesting is to explore what happens when you go from zero composition helium to 10%. Below, you have to go below 10% to see really what would happen and how the disorder builds up. But this is not yet done. This is where the interesting region would be. Going above 10%, 15% and up doesn't change much because you have larger fluctuations, but you have, as they are shorter range, you have more quantum confinement, you have more quantum tunneling, and this smooths out everything. So now let's go to the real stuff, which is devices. What happens indeed when we apply an electric voltage to an LED, which is again those multi-layers of gallium nitride and indium gallium nitride. So you put voltage, of course you will get a current. You have to be able to describe the transport of carriers into the device. There we start already to have problem. As Marcel told you, we don't have yet a full description of transport in our disordered system. So what we did so far is to use classical transport, what we call drip diffusion equations. We just say that when you have carriers somewhere in the material, carriers can move because of diffusion. You have unequal population, non-homogeneous population of carriers, so they can diffuse or they can drift due to an applied electric field. So those are the so-called drip diffusion equations. We will do our computations using those equations, but of course the problem is what are the parameters you use. So normally, if you want to do it completely this computation self-consistently, you should use parameters without disorder, and then you compute with disorder. But we don't have the parameters without disorder in an alloy, because by definition an alloy is disordered. So we try to have parameters which has as little perturb as possible by disorder. So we take parameters with very low concentrations of helium, and then we'll input them, we'll put those parameters into higher helium composition. But there is a problem here. It's a circular argument, okay? It's a chicken and egg problem. How do you get disorderless material for disordered material? It's a problem. So anyway, and also what we know is that those drip diffusion equations should not be correct, because actually as we have localized states, okay, it's disordered system, we have localized states under certain condition, then we know that the transport is more like popping transport, and of course the future discussions will be how to get together those two types of transport, drip diffusion and droplet transport. But for the moment we'll use drip diffusion equations. The next thing is we have also to compute, to know what are the recombination processes, okay, like in diodes, that's what we're interested in. How do electron and hole recombine and there are a number of processors, non-radiative processors with recombination of electron holes on defects, emission of photons, and higher order processors. What I won't discuss here. A thing I did not talk to you so far is that nitrides are nice, emit very nice light, but they are complicated. They have internal electric fields because they are piezoelectric. They are very different atoms with different electrical charges. So then we have electric fields inside the material. I won't discuss this in detail, but what it gives is that instead of having quantum wells heterostructure where you have conduction band and well-behaved heterostructures with square types of potentials. As you have electric fields, you have this type of spiky potentials instead of having regular, rectangular potentials that you would expect in heterostructures without internal electric fields. So that's another complication that we have to put into the full computations with many parameters again. And now, just to give you a taste of what we are doing, we inject electrons and they will transport over barriers. They will move in the plane because in the plane we have disorder. And so, to do the full computation of such a device, we have first to compute the electric fields, the polarization charges in these materials. We have to solve the potential, so then we know the energy levels of the conduction band and valence band. Then, having the electric fields, we know the potential, we know the composition, we know the equation to solve for the landscape equation, for the Schrödinger equation or the landscape equation. Then, having the energy levels, we can compute the density of carriers, electron and holes. Having the density of carrier of electron and holes, having the electric fields, we can solve the drift diffusion equations. Solving the drift diffusion equations, we know the carriers everywhere. We can compute now, again, the charges, because we have injected electron and holes. So we have to recompute the Poisson equation, the electric fields, because we have carriers now. So we want to do self-consistent computations. So when we do that, we look if the potential we get in the end is the one we had at the beginning. If it was not the one we had at the beginning, we have to use the new charges and potentials to compute again the landscape, the drift diffusion equations, and see if the charges we get now correspond to what was the beginning, the potential. And if not, we try to do those loops several times. Typically, it's 10 to 15 times those loops, if I remember well, to get something which is stable, in which we have indeed, for a given applied voltage, the correct current and a stable solution for the charges in the system. It seems complicated, but that's the only way to compute this. So what we do is finite element method, and you have typically 1 million nodes to compute to have a good precision, because of course in the quantum wells here the fluctuations are of the order of 5 nanometers. So indeed your mesh must be smaller than 5 nanometers, at least in those regions, to be able to compute something which is significant. You have many parameters to use. And again, the choice of parameters is extremely important. Again, let me emphasize that those parameters, when they are measured, take into account disorder, and you are using parameters which take into account disorder to compute disorder, which is a little, quite a small problem. But when you do that, what you find in the end for instance, is that for a given, so this is for, I think this is for 20 amps per square centimeter on average, so this is for a typical applied voltage of 3 volts to your LED, and you find, for instance, that the distribution of your current is very inhomogeneous in a given plane of alloy. And what you find is that electrons, for instance, here, transport in a very inhomogeneous way across the various layers. So it means that instead of being going through the multi-layer stacks, okay, all those layers, electrons will find pathways of minimal energies to go from one side of your LED to the other side. So it's completely inhomogeneous, and no one-dimensional simulator can give you that type of result. And this is extremely important because this is at the origin of explaining why the turn-on voltage, well, the voltage you apply to an LED, a blue LED, is about 3 volts, because when you do the simple calculations of every commercial simulator that you could buy today, which are 1D simulator, you would find in a normal simulator a difference, a larger voltage of 1 volt. You would have to apply 1 volt more to have transport, because just going over the different layers in your multi-layer stack gives you 1 volt penalty, whereas as you find those percolation paths to the minimum energies in your disordered system, you can go, you get 1 voltage. But of course, this 1 volt difference is extremely important for the efficiency of LEDs. Commercial softwares do better than that. Of course, you have commercial softwares which will give you something which is very near what is being measured and what we compute here with disorder. We just tell you what they will do is they will artificially diminish the internal electric fields in an LED by saying, well, we take 50% of the computed electric fields instead of 100%. Of course, when you take 50%, you diminish those spikes, and of course, electrons travel more easily, and then of course, you diminish the applied voltage. But this is a trick. But indeed, it tells you something interesting. So it's not so bad, okay? It gives you some interesting result. It just tells you that disorder is equivalent to diminishing the fields, okay? For the problem of transport of carriers, diminishing the fields is equivalent to transporting through the disordered material. Or, say conversely, disorder helps you to diminish the effectiveness of internal electric fields in those materials. Just to show you just a few things more about the computation times that Marcel mentioned. When you look at one computation of energy levels in a plane, what you find is that it takes 50 seconds by the location landscape, and when you try to solve Schrödinger equation, typically it's a few hours to 1 day. Okay, so that's the game. Now, if you compute one operation for an LED, okay, if you solve Poisson equation and Drake diffusion equation for the type of mesh that we are using, it's very fast. Okay, again, it's 1 minute. Okay, 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute. Now, if you want to compute a full LED, which means you have to make many iterations, 45 bias points and self-consistent, I told you 10 to 15 iterations, you have to multiply all those numbers by 45 and times 10 to 15, which means that when you do a computation of an LED with one of the U, it takes you 1 day. It's a typical 1 day computation. If you don't compute the energy levels at all, you just take EC and EV, it will be also 1 day. But if you would have to use Schrödinger equation, it would be more than 1 year. So it transforms something that it's impractical, and indeed nobody computes self-consistently LED devices except when you use landscape equation. Then just to show you what we are doing these days, big problem of LEDs, big challenge, is what we call the green gap. If you look at the efficiency of all LEDs produced so far, you find that you have very good efficiencies in the blue, quite good in the red, and in between, in the green, the efficiencies drop a lot. Just to show you one origin of this green gap, which is a major issue in the efficiency of lighting, what you find is that instead of having to apply a voltage which is just equal to the energy of photons that you emit, which is true for blue LEDs. In blue LEDs, you just supply 3 electron volts to each electron volt pairs. You apply 3 volts, and you get a 3 electron volt photon. When you are in the green, you have much higher voltages. And when you compute this is a landscape computation again, what you find is that when you increase the number of quantum wells in a green LED, for each quantum well that you add, and you need a number of quantum wells to have a good LED, you see that you add typically 0.4 volts each time you add a quantum well. So in the end, when you have 6 quantum wells, you typically lost 2 volts. And this is a major challenge. To solve this, you have to diminish the energy barriers, the electric fields. You have various ways, but just to whet your appetite. Recently, in one paper, this gap is almost closed by this point, which is due to using very different systems. Instead of having stacks, well-defined stacks of barriers and quantum wells layers, you have a geometry which is called the VP. Okay, you have here a defect, and you inject electron and volts on the side instead of traveling well through the multi-layers and having the voltage penalty at each quantum well. And injecting sideways solves somewhat this problem. It's ongoing work, but that's very interesting, and this is what we have to fully understand now. Thank you for your attention.